Welcome back, beasties. In part one, we looked at the facts, not the legend, not the embellishments, but what we can reasonably piece together from contemporary reports. Between 1764 and 1767, an unidentified animal killed dozens of people in rural France. Not randomly, not opportunistically, but repeatedly and with a pattern. And by the end of it, the accepted conclusions began to feel increasingly uncomfortable. So, if this wasn't a wolf, what was it? Today, we're going to explore the main theories, and we'll see which one actually holds up. Let's start with the obvious explanation, because it is the obvious one. But there are reasons it doesn't make sense to me. France in the 18th century had wolves, had a lot of them. They were absolutely responsible for occasional attacks, particularly on children. So, on the surface, the case does seem straightforward. It really could be a wolf or wolves that developed a taste for human prey. But when you look closer, things begin to break down. The scale alone is unusual, even for that period. We're not talking about a handful of attacks over decades. We're talking about sustained, targeted killings over roughly 3 years. Then there's the behaviour. The beast didn't just attack. It often went for the head and neck, sometimes decapitating its victims, which was documented at least 15 times. It also showed little fear of humans, and it repeatedly evaded organised hunts involving experienced wolf hunters. Now, none of this is impossible for a wolf, but taken together, it does become unlikely. And then we, of course, have the eyewitness descriptions. The reddish coat with pale spots along its sides and stomach. Its unusual size, often described about the size of a mature calf. The long tail with the tuft at the end. And then the dark stripe along the back. Some even described something closer to a cat's movement, rather than something canid or dog-like. And it's at this point that just a wolf, as an explanation, starts to feel more like default or acceptance, rather than a conclusion based on evidence. Another explanation is that there was no single beast. That what we're really looking at is a combination of normal wolf attacks, misidentifications, and a growing sense of panic. In other words, mass hysteria. And it's not an unreasonable theory. Once fear takes hold, people do start to connect events that might otherwise have been separate. Descriptions become exaggerated. Stories begin to merge. And suddenly, you don't just have several incidents, you have a single unstoppable monster. But again, there are problems with this theory. Most of the attacks show consistency in their location, in the victim profile, and in the animal's methodology. And that consistency stretches over time across the 3 years the beast was active. That's difficult to explain purely through coincidence or imagination. Fear absolutely can distort perception, but it doesn't usually create the natural patterns we see in truthful observation. Now, we come to one of the most persistent parts of the story, that of Jean Chastel. Jean Chastel is the man often credited with killing the beast, at least when it comes to the folklore. The story involves all of the things that you might expect: silver bullets, prayers, and a calm, almost mythic confrontation where the beast compliantly approached Chastel. It's a compelling image, but historically, I don't think it's especially reliable. And incidentally, this is where I believe the folklore of the trained beast comes from, as we'll see. We should remember that Jean Chastel was politically astute and his family had a reputation, and it wasn't a good one. They were known for conflict with the authorities for a start. And it's very probable that they were using the situation to their advantage. It's worth noting as well that Jean Chastel in fact spent a significant amount of the beast's rampage in jail after trying to trick Francois Antoine, the king's appointed hunter, and his men into navigating a perilous swamp which the Chastels declared safe. Jean Chastel was not actually released until 4 days after Francois had left the region some 6 months later, because Francois was worried about him retaliating. But it's actually Antoine Chastel, Jean's son, who is the more interesting character to me. Like his father, Antoine was a suspected poacher and known to hold a grudge. Among other things, he was also rumoured to be a werewolf, which is almost certainly where that aspect of the legend entered the folklore and started making the water that little bit muddier. But he also, most importantly, very likely bred wolf-dog hybrids for hunting. And that really matters to the story, because it changes how we might interpret their role. As does a very suspicious incident where one of Chastel's nephews spotted a large wolf watching a group of children herding cattle. He shot the wolf from 110 feet away and kills it with a single shot, which already goes against the grain of other incidents involving the beast, which at this point has deflected and shrugged off numerous bullets and blades. The Chastels take a great deal of interest in this and order the corpse of the wolf found, which it is 3 days later. The wolf is scalped and skinned so that the reward could be claimed. And at this point, it is revealed that the wolf has a turned-in left paw, which the Chastels claim is a track recognised from a previous location of an attack. And we should probably ask why the Chastels were so insistent on recovering the wolf's body even after the reward had been claimed. I strongly suspect that this was one of their wolf dogs and they knew the animal, hence knowing some of the biology. Killing it and claiming it as the beast was easy money. And in fact, I believe Chastel did this again nearly 2 years later in 1767. At this point, he saw 2 wolves near his home, and he shot and killed the one he described as monstrous, but in fact, it measured just 127 centimetres and weighed 53.4 kilograms. According to the records, that shows that this wolf was in fact smaller than the one he shot in 1765. This is also the event that became part of the legend where he was approached calmly by a wolf, which again, for me, shows anomalies that draw suspicion on Jean Chastel. Even at the time, he is strongly suspected for tampering with the autopsy to place bloodied rags in the animal's stomach, and the animal is also thought to have been prettied up to look like the beast. We do know that King Louis was certainly not impressed and ordered the animal buried at Versailles after it was presented to him. So rather than seeing Jean Chastel as a kind of chosen figure who ended the terror, I think it's more realistic to place him alongside others at the time. These are the people, the hunters, who killed large animals and presented them as the beast in order to claim the rewards. And this has already happened more than once in the story. So while Chastel may well have killed an animal linked to the attacks, and we should acknowledge that the attacks did seemingly cease within 2 days of this event, there's still little solid evidence that this was a singular definitive end. And certainly there's no reason to elevate the story into something mythological. Both the Chastel family and Francois Antoine presented animals they claimed to the beast. In fact, Antoine toured France with his. But both were likely wolves, altered to look more aggressive or larger for the purpose. They both received rewards, and in Antoine's case, a pension. Yet, ultimately, we must remember the killings did not stop. In Antoine's case, they continued for another 18 months. And in Chastel's, they stopped being documented because they were limited to a very remote region known for significant poverty. In short, most people stopped caring, and eventually the killings did come to an end. But not the story. So, if it wasn't a typical wolf, and not just hysteria, we need to think about looking at something else, perhaps something a bit outside the box. An animal that fits the descriptions, that meets those behaviour aspects we've seen, and the sheer difficulty people had in killing it. This is where the exotic animal theory comes in. And specifically, I want to focus on the idea of it being a big cat. Now, at first, that sounds unlikely, and I know you're all thinking that my default setting is towards big cats, but I'd argue that I'm in a pretty good position to spot the behaviour of one. And we should remember that 18th century Europe is not isolated. Exotic animals were being imported, traded, and they did sometimes escape or were released. There are documented cases of lions and other large predators appearing far outside their native ranges. And we know that there was both a trade route that entered France from the east, with connections through Italy to Tunisia and Africa. We also know there were popular animal fighting pits, like one in Paris, documented just a few decades before the events in Gévaudan, that was supplied by this trade route and others like it. So the idea itself isn't impossible. The real question is, does it fit the evidence? When you compare the reports, something really sticks out, and that's how several of the key descriptions continuously align. First, there's the tawny reddish colouring of the animal. It's always described as having relatively dense fur and long claws. The long tail, often described having a tuft. The powerful forequarters. A wide chest and a big head with short, upright ears. And there's that tendency we talked about to attacking the head and the neck. The last point is particularly important because that's generally how big cats kill. Not just by pulling prey down and tearing at the body like a dog would, but by going straight for the throat or the face. Now, there are two cases I want to look at in particular which support the idea, in my view, of the beast being transported to France and it indeed being a big cat. On the 4th of September 1765, 18-year-old Isabeau Pascal was chased by the beast. Instinctively, she climbed into the high-sided cart that was being drawn by her horse. The beast showed a very uncharacteristic reluctance and hesitance to go near the cart, and this is how Isabeau eventually escaped. Had it perhaps been in one before and not enjoyed the experience? Then, 4 days later, 12-year-old Marie-Jeanne Ballier was killed by the beast. She was carried to the top of a nearby mountain. Her face had been mauled and her throat had been bitten clean through. But most importantly, in this case, were the claw marks on her belly where the animal had attacked her and pinned her down whilst it ate. That's not a wolf. We should also factor in that the beast went against the behaviour of the known wolves of the area. For a start, it was most active between January and May, and almost absent in June and July, when Gévaudan's wolves were at their most prolific during cub raising season. This is also coincidentally the time the beast would have had a bounty of wild newborn deer and wild goats to feed on. And then, as we've hinted at so many times so far, there's the behaviour. There are countless examples of the beast carrying its victims considerable distances, and in some cases caching and partially covering their remains. It was observed on several occasions sitting or lying on high vantage points, evaluating the landscape and resting. It also favours ambush attacks from concealed places like behind walls or forest edges. And it survives blasts from shotguns and carbines when, as Francois and other hunters showed, the region's wolves were easily felled, usually with a single shot. The beast also showed unusual confidence around humans. It didn't behave like a persecuted wolf. It behaved much more like an apex predator, one that didn't recognise humans as a threat. Statistically, it's been estimated that there is less than a 1 in 1,000 chance that the beast was a wolf. The conclusion of German biologist Karl-Heinz Tag in his book The Gévaudan Tragedy is that the beast was in fact a subadult male lion. He also wrote a research paper in 2024 comparing the attacks of the beast to those of the Cerveau lions, which he surmised as the 19th century man-eating Cerveau lions, Panthera leo, and the 18th century French Beast of Gévaudan shared similar behavioural patterns and a high level of physical resilience to gunshot wounds. So a subadult, possibly displaced and possibly struggling to hunt natural prey. That explanation works on a number of levels. As we know from the Cerveau lions, manes are not necessarily a physical feature all male lions have. Many populations of lions in more arid conditions, such as in northern and eastern Africa, which is where an 18th century lion would likely come from, tend to show this genetic variation for maneless lions. Furthermore, the mane doesn't usually become really established until 5 or 6 years of age, and is rarely beyond a goatee at best from around the age of 3. But maybe a subadult male isn't the only possibility. Only one eyewitness described male genitalia, but that's a single account under stressful conditions. She was literally fending off and attacking the lion. And it's worth noting that both male and female lions have fur along the underside that could be misinterpreted at a distance, especially on an animal you're not familiar with. And it's also interesting in that almost every report and handwritten account, the beast is referred to as she. Now, were eyewitnesses picking up on some kind of female quality the beast gave off, or was this just the custom of the time, which we see some indication of? It's hard to know. But to me, in many ways, at least, a lioness is just as plausible. And in fact, when you think about it, in some ways, maybe even more so. Lionesses are the primary hunters. They are efficient, persistent, and capable of targeting smaller, more vulnerable prey, like the women and children the beast favoured. But whether it was a young male or a lioness, the broader point stands. A lion fits the pattern far more clearly than a wolf. Of course, France is not Africa. So how does a lion end up in Gévaudan? There are a few possibilities. The first is possibly an escaped animal from a private menagerie, but there are also travelling exhibitions. It could have even been something brought back from colonial territories. We don't have a definitive answer. But we don't need one to recognise that such movements of animals did happen and occasionally went wrong. As far as the theory about the beast being a hyena, I think this comes down to two anecdotal pieces of evidence, which I'm not dismissing, but I just don't think hold up against the rest of the significant evidence for it being a lion. The first is that both Jean and Antoine Chastel may have had a link to the exotic animal trade, specifically to a private menagerie in the south of France, where one of the animals within that collection was a brown hyena. The second is perhaps a simple and understandable error in the account itself. Early in the beast rampage, it is Etienne Lafont, the regional delegate, who uses the Histoire naturelle générale et particulière avec la description du cabinet du roi, or A Natural History of the King's Court by Georges Louis Leclerc de Buffon, to identify the beast. He says the hyena best resembles the animal he has seen. But crucially, the only two engravings in this volume are in fact of a male and female lion, and they sit on the same page as the description of the hyena. Could it just be a case of the wrong data being recorded? Author J.M. Smith, in his book Beast of Gévaudan, The Making of a Beast, suggests that the social, intellectual, cultural and political currents of French life in the 1760s were the perfect powder keg for mass hysteria, and that it was in fact normal wolf attacks just blown out of all proportion. But for me, the statistics, the methodology and the sheer scale of the attacks doesn't support such an academic conclusion. When you consider that approximately 1,000 wolf attacks were recorded across Europe since 1700, not including the animals with rabies, that's an average of 5 per year from the dates of the data we have. Adjusted to 2026, it's actually just over 3 per year. Whatever the Beast of Gévaudan was, it wasn't rabid, as it enjoyed over 3 years of terror. And in that time, we must remember it killed over 100 people and seriously injured nearly 200 more. So, where does this leave us? Ultimately, we can't prove beyond a doubt what the beast actually was. But a wolf or wolves doesn't fit the physical description or behaviour. For me, mass hysteria doesn't explain the consistency and the sheer number of recorded attacks. The Chastel story is likely overstated. But a large cat, a lion, possibly young, possibly displaced, that explanation aligns with almost everything, from the physical descriptions to the method of attack and the behaviour observed. In my opinion, at least, better than anything. But that doesn't make it certain, of course, by any means. But it does make it compelling, and perhaps that's why this story endures. Because even now, centuries later, we're still left with the same question. Not whether something was there, but what exactly it was. And maybe that's the real legacy of the Beast of Gévaudan. Not just the fear it caused, but the uncertainty it left behind. Because sometimes the most unsettling stories aren't the ones that we can explain easily. They're the ones where the explanation remains obscured. Thank you as always for watching. If you've enjoyed it, please do like the video and consider subscribing to the channel. It all makes a difference and helps. And maybe you'll like my books too, which feature the same blend of history, unknown animals and predatory nature. So please do go check them out on Amazon and Audible. And join me again very soon. Bye for now.